Okay, and with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter tonight, Jim Bowden. Um, he is a writer, a book author, a college lecturer, and an activist, all in one. He's been an activist in Virginia since 1992. He co-founded the Virginia First Foundation in 2015 to change our culture for the better. He's a retired Army officer, has 7 grandchildren, serves as a deacon in his church. Graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1972. He earned graduate degrees at Harvard and Columbia. And he's taught at the U.S. Military Academy, and he's been adjunct faculty at William and Mary, also here in Virginia. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jim for his presentation tonight, How the American Left Went Commie. Take it away, Jim.
We're going to talk about 7 institutions which shape American culture and civilization. And the presentation will show how 5 of the 7 have been conquered by the left. And that this conquest goes all the way back to 1790 and the French Revolution. I have one disclaimer, and that is that the slides are too dense, and I know it. We could spend 45 minutes on any one of them. Some of them we could actually write a book on, or you could spend an entire seminar on it. But I crammed in examples from the wealth of data that I believe supports my narrative. And I acknowledge that my narrative isn't definitive. It is strongly suggestive of what happened and how. Okay. All right, on becoming Human Secularist Totalitarians. Let's begin with the givens. Colonial America had 4 starting subcultures. We'll show them in a few slides. Now, these subcultures had been in conflict in the past in the British Isles, and there were substantive differences from the very start. Upon our independence, however, there was a consensus culture that crossed over these regions and covered, despite the differences, covered them all. And the consensus culture was developed over the years. So one key point that I want to make before we go ahead, and that is I make distinctions between culture and subculture that are not common in popular usage, and especially like in public schools. I would argue that in all of history, from the tiniest tribe to the greatest civilization, every society has only had one culture at a time. There have been multi-ethnic, and there have been multilingual and pluralistic cultures, but there's never, ever been a multicultural society. Culture commands. So those subcultures came together for our revolution, the 13 colonies. But our revolution itself was shaped by the Enlightenment. And there were different Enlightenments which shaped 2 different revolutions. And over time, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And over time, some of the American subcultures, not every one, but a large enough number, a governing majority of the people there, adopted the evolved ideas of the French Revolution. And when they did that, they adopted the ideas of Human Secularist Totalitarianism. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's who they are. My shorthand for Human Secular Totalitarianism is commie. So I know people don't like being called that, but I believe that's who they are, and that's what we'll talk about. So then, through time, obviously, it's obvious that major currents and key events happen. I mean, when the tectonic plates shift, it matters. When you go from an agrarian society, from a frontier society, to an agrarian society, to an industrial society, to a post-industrial society, that changes every aspect of life. So that happened in the 230 years from 1790 to 2020. And we'll touch on that and how that happened, how it happened differently in the United States and why it mattered differently within the United States. And in that time, the Human Secular Totalitarians, the commies, came to dominate 5 of the 7 American institutions which define American culture and civilization. So let's see how that happened. All right, let's begin. This is where I probably screwed up before because I got my little thing here, and then when I hit enter, it doesn't work. Okay, so take a look at our map. Red dots, blue dots, white dots. they've been fighting each other for a long, long time. The Celts in Ireland and the Celts in Scotland, when this area with the blue and whites, when it was finally invaded en masse by the Romans in 43 BC, they fought these people who lived here from 43 BC till the last rising of the Highland clans in 1745. They were warring cultures. In around the year 800, the people who lived here got invaded by the blue dots and made the white dots move this way. The Anglo-Saxons got moved over here, and the Vikings got moved over here. Eventually, Alfred the Great united everyone in England a short time before the Normans invaded, and then put their imprimatur on top of everything. But the point is these subcultures, and they're distinct subcultures, have been fighting each other for a long time. So the differences began from the start. I like to joke that the moment the Yankees showed up in Massachusetts, the people were different. They had different accents. They had different colloquialisms. They were distinct subcultures. The first subculture, where I live right now, is Tidewater. Was Tidewater, Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, were predominantly Anglican. And that subculture was shaped by the losers of the English Civil War, the Cavaliers who came here, and they created this society which is aristocratic, agrarian, and had and still has, a live and let live attitude, a way of being. New England was dominated by the Puritans from East Anglia, and they were and are absolutists. That's why we have Rhode Island and Connecticut, because of the people they drove out of Massachusetts. They were and remain a my way or the highway subculture. If you disagreed with a Puritan, you were either ignorant, evil, or insane. And I would argue if you disagree with a commie, leftist, however you want to designate them, as I said, I prefer to call them commie, they will tell you that you're either ignorant, evil, or insane. The Middle Atlantic, which is dominated by New York City and Philadelphia, was mainly settled by the Quakers from the Midlands and the dissenting Protestant sects from the Palatinate, if I'm pronouncing it properly, area of Germany. And they're all about hard work and commerce. They're great at building great farms and at making money. And then there's the Appalachian frontier. The Appalachian frontier had a broad range of people, a great mix of people, but it was dominated by the Scot-Irish. And I love talking about the Scot-Irish because my ancestry is Tidewater and Appalachia, but primarily Appalachia as they moved west. And when the Scot-Irish landed on the docks in Philadelphia, the good Germans and English pointed to the frontier in Pennsylvania and said, go that way. That's where the Indians are. Go. And they referred to them as the scum of the earth. So that's our claim to fame. The Scot-Irish culture is their main thing is family, faith, and freedom. Leave me alone, family, faith, and freedom. But if you threaten my family, faith, or freedom, I will kill you. So now we have these differences. And what I want to say here is if you go to Jamestown, not too far from where I live, if you go to either the U.S. National Park or the State Exhibit, you will see a movie and you'll see on the signs there, signage, that essentially three co-equal cultures, one they call European and one they call African and one they call indigenous people, melded into this multicultural ensemble, which is Virginia and now America. And I would argue that that is not so. What you didn't have three cultures that came together to create one. You had four subcultures which assimilated everybody else, including my French Huguenot ancestors who were assimilated and started speaking English and became good Virginians. So they assimilated others. Other people contributed, and I'm not disregarding the contribution of other people, but they were assimilated into the subcultures. And the subcultures are different. I'm taking an aside here. I could do it elsewhere in the presentation, but I'll do it now. So have you ever heard of an expression, northern gentleman? Have you ever heard of an expression, northern hospitality? You may have heard of the expression New York minute. Have you ever heard of a Mississippi minute? How long would a Mississippi minute be? And those are just off-the-cuff examples of the fact that there are differences and the differences remain. So, e pluribus unum, we came together. And when we came together, there were some, despite the differences in the subcultures, and they were distinct, there were things that were unifying. The country was over 98% Protestant. The King James Bible was read by almost everyone. Even though 9% of the population spoke German, the official business of all the colonies was done in English. There was a high literacy rate, and the Great Awakening touched the entire 13 colonies. It's said that it was estimated that George Whitefield, one of the evangelists, spoke to 85% of the people who were living at one time, which is pretty incredible. So the country came together. We have a consensus. We had the beginning of a consensus culture, and it is not whiteness. So this is what America was. It was basically the initial American creed has been called dissident Protestantism without God. And you can see all the characteristics there, English language. I'm not going to read every item on the slide because I can't get this done in 45 minutes. But you'll see in red the points that I want to highlight. So there was a consensus culture. And those things on the left are recognizable to you. As I said again, it was not whiteness. Over time, the American creed became the American identity, because America is a set of ideas that has a place and speaks a language. American became the identity became political in those shared ideas. We went from expected observance and commitment to religion to religious symbols. We still say the Pledge of Allegiance that says we're in one nation under God. Our currency says that we're one nation under God. And the American identity became more ideological. And as each wave of immigrants came to the United States, when they went to war, they paid the blood tax, and they became part of the consensus culture. And so more and different people became fully American. And I know people would make the exception for Black Americans, and that is a separate case. But I would argue, while they were enslaved and then discriminated against, they were completely 100% American. And the red arrow, let's put everything on a timeline. The red arrow is the expanse of our American consensus culture, with political horizons of Jefferson on the left and Hamilton on the right, and the four subcultures fitting inside that consensus culture. That consensus culture has a worldview. It believes in American exceptionalism. And then I put some major events on above that. And then I indicate the crack in time. Things were happening all along, but the crack in time, the time when it was obvious that there was a problem there, culture war began, in fact, in earnest, was in 1962 when the Supreme Court ended school prayer in public schools. And on our left, we have the Human Secular Totalitarianism of the French Revolution. So, okay, and what I'm suggesting here is that from 1792 to 1962, the New England and Middle Atlantic subcultures, not everybody, but enough, the governing majority, and the subculture where it had migrated to San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, and then later to Los Angeles, adopted the evolved ideas of the French Revolution. So let's take a step back. Let's return to the Enlightenment and see how our worldview and thus our culture is in conflict with the evolved French culture. Let's look at France. In France, the Enlightenment was the ideology of reason. It was decidedly anti-cleric, which meant anti-Roman Catholic in France. They were believing Christians in the French Enlightenment, but they weren't the big influencers, to use social network terms. That idea of the Enlightenment, the French idea, became popularized by human secularists everywhere in the 19th century. The idea that the Enlightenment was anti-religious, anti-Christian, and anti-biblical is popular and is what is taught in a lot of public schools now. There's another Enlightenment that happened in Great Britain, and it was focused on the sociology of virtue. They included some agnostics and atheists, but they had others like Sir Isaac Newton who were devoutly Christian. In fact, that Enlightenment was empowered by their version of Christianity. Because if you take an unseen sovereign creator God from Jewish mysticism and you combine it with the independence from ecclesiastical authority, which you have from the Protestant Reformation, and then you mix that with the rational empiricism of ancient Greece, then it opens up the world of natural sciences to be discoverable. Because everything is designed, everything can be discoverable. So it was hijacked by the secularists. And then we have the American. The American Enlightenment was focused on political liberty. And thinking Americans went through an if-then exercise to arrive at revolution. It's hard to find explicit instructions to revolt in the Bible, but Americans used the natural law implicit in the Bible as the justification for overthrowing the state. And as we recall, their British ancestors had set the precedent by replacing three heads of state, Charles I, Oliver Cromwell's son, and Charles II, in the 1600s. We weren't the first to do it. So from our American Enlightenment, we have a revolutionary worldview. And basically, we keep the biblical worldview from Great Britain. The words that are written on the left are not, they're familiar to you. You know them well. That this is our consistent culture. We had a revolution which has often been called a conservative revolution. It didn't overthrow the norms. It didn't overthrow every structure in society. For example, there was a governor of Virginia before the revolution, and then during the revolution when Virginia declared itself an independent state, then after the revolution through the Irish Confederation, and after the 1787 Constitution. We had a conservative revolution, and we had and retained a biblical worldview. On the other hand, France tries to change everything. They abolished the States General, which dated back to 1302. They changed the calendar. They changed how many days in a week. And they had lovely words, liberty, equality, and fraternity, that didn't work out. When they failed to achieve equality, but as people today would call it equity, equality, they found an enemy to blame. The nobility, the bourgeoisie, and the clerics were the problem. And the answer was to get at the guillotine and kill them. The terror was about killing them to solve the problem. The French view is antagonistic to the American worldview, even though we've celebrated each other's revolutions through the years. So the ideas of the French Revolution don't stop with the busy guillotine during the terror. They sow bad seeds, and they have new thinkers that come along trying to make it work right. Now, you've heard the line about socialism and communism that it just hasn't been done the right way before. Well, it's an old song. This isn't an exhaustive list of the leftist contributions to the bad seed, but it's illustrative of some of the key figures. And the ideas, as I said before, have a name. It is Human Secularist Totalitarianism. Then the major currents of change. Obviously, we went through tremendous change. And I want to point out a couple of things here on our route, because there are a couple of things that stand out. The first thing is the war in 1861 to 1865. That was the greatest period of disunity in the entire country. It was the worst, most awful war, the worst experience that our country's ever had. And then 90 years later, you have the greatest period of unity in the country ever, the other war, World War II. I refer to them as the war and the other war because when I was a kid in the 1950s, listening to my family talk, and they'd start telling stories about the war, and I'd have to listen for a while to figure out which war they were talking about because they had oral histories of the war and the war. The other thing are the shock of World War I, the first shock, and the shock of the Great Depression. World War I was catastrophic. It didn't shuck corn, it shocked. It shocked Western civilization to its core. There was no good answer for that war, for what had happened, what had been gained, and what was lost. The Great Depression, likewise, it shocked Western civilization, and it shocked America. Until 1930, there had always been a labor shortage in the United States, in America, and then in the United States. And in 1930, for the first time, there were more people than there were jobs. So, great change happened. It was obvious, obviously, but it was not deterministic. Excuse me. So, the subculture shifted. New people, as immigrants, came in and were assimilated into the founding subcultures. The war, the first war, after that war, two subcultures, Tidewater and Appalachia, morphed together to become the South. And I can't overstate the devastation that happened in the South during that, because of that war and Reconstruction. There was a 90-year recovery. There were 3 to 4 generations of poverty caused by that war. The other subcultures, Mid-Atlantic and New England, then dominated all things that were called American. The new subcultures arose. You have a urban Jewish subculture, and you can see on the timeline. Timeline is not exact, but it's close enough. It's approximate. And then a urban black subculture beginning after World War I, with the big migration from the south to the north and to the far west from the south of black Americans. But today, it's changed. It changed. There are large minorities, ethnic minorities of Hispanics, plural, Asians, plural, but it'll be a while to see to what degree those ethnic minorities are assimilated by the subcultures that exist, or in fact become their own distinct subculture within America. And I don't have it. I can't. I don't have a guess on how that's going to turn out right now. I don't know. But the other thing is that there's been a shift in that the worldviews are now tend to be held individually, and that the rural and urban divide is in fact nationwide. It is nationwide, but it is accentuated by regional subcultures. There's still a difference between the North, the South, the East, and the West. So now we're going to get into how it happened. And this is actually the meat and potatoes, and I'm going to roll through here. You know, my analogies may be a reach, the one on cancer and the one on snow avalanche. But I believe that's how it happened through time. It's slow build up, and then a sudden appearance of symptoms like in cancer, or a sudden crack in the snow, and then everything happened apparently rapidly. It all happened at one time. The catalyst, to use another analogy, the catalyst for all this was the transformation in the institution of education. Higher education moved from Christian colleges and universities to secular schools. They adopted the ideas of the French Revolution, they gave the bad seed new names, and now they're cultural Marxists. Americans changed their self-identity. And yet we still have a subculture that has an imprint in terms of on how we live. So 7 mountains of American culture, you can also call them 7 pillars: government and military, business, education, media, arts and entertainment, religion, and family. I would argue that the elites, the elite left, has dominated 5 of them. Business is still in contention. The elites may dominate the larger corporations, but 60% of business in the United States, or the economy, is small businesses, and many of them, depending on whether or not they're rural or urban, whether they're affected, which region they're from, are not dominated by, they're both conservative and commie, either or. And then the family, religion's in contention, and the family is in contention. So this is the, we could spend a lot of time here, and it's really interesting. I mean, fascinating reading to look at. The education went from deeply Christian sectarian Protestant schools to non-sectarian Protestant to ecumenical to secular to anti-Christian hostility. And the shift could be characterized as small steps based on good intentions with unforeseen consequences. Now, it took a hard twist in the 1800s because over 8,000 scholars, mainly from the Northeast and Middle Atlantic, studied in Germany during the 1800s and became infatuated with those German ideas. Bildung, the Lehrfreiheit, and the Wissenschaft, and then ultimately cultural Marxism from the Frankfurt School. And those ideas have shaped our academic institutions. Along the way, there were counter movements, and they were not equal to the momentum of the dominant culture. And below the line, I've got some examples of things that could be called counter movements or things that were going against the tide. But the elites, and this is the key point, education is the progenitor, and the elites for 150 years go to leadership in every other institution in the country. The elites get educated, and then they go to be leaders in all the other institutions. Government. There are many books that have been written about what's happened from the year 1900. You can make the argument that the Constitution was violated grossly during the first war, the recent unpleasantness with the assertion of federal authority. But Congress pulled a lot of that back in 40 years after the war. From the 1900s, though, forward, it is a steady progression of the shredding of the Constitution by all 3 branches of the federal government, and especially the judiciary, which is ironic. The keepers of the Constitution are the ones that I accuse of judicial tyranny. So our American highway to hell in government is well documented. But the big break comes with the judicial tyranny, and where they were empowered by the moral ethical cloak of civil rights, but they became black-robed priest kings, and they've exercised that authority. Business. Difference between big business and small business, obviously. Every society and its ruling authority, whether they call it a government or tribal leaders or whatever, there's always been a mix of government and business. That was true from the beginning of the colonies. It's true, as I said, back in former civilizations and tribes. It's true today. What the big shift, though, was with the New Deal. And in the New Deal, the federal government used the Commerce Clause to extend itself pervasively, so that if you're the chicken that you have in Brooklyn that you're going to consume in Brooklyn and not go anywhere else, somehow becomes under the authority of the federal government. And then after World War II, governments at every level become a major employer, purchaser of goods and services. So government did not let any crisis go to waste. The media. We have a free press, it's a constitutional requirement, but the big break there was after Vietnam with the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. I don't think everyone knew, or most Americans knew, that Walter Cronkite was left of center. He was like everyone's uncle or grandpa. And so when he announced that the Vietnam War was lost, or we should withdraw in 1968, it was pretty shattering. It was a huge deal. But after that, from the 70s on, empowered by Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, the media went whole hog, went to the left. Arts and entertainment. There's always been a conflict. There's always been what's behind closed doors and what's in the open, and what's allowed, what's not allowed. The artists have always wanted to be edgy, but what was private became public in the 1960s. And from the 1960s on, in arts and entertainment, they're always trying to see what's next. I understand recently there's a movie out that talks about the challenges of a cannibal lifestyle, and that's how edgy they can get. Cannibals are us. Then in religion, human secularism is a religion. There is an endowed chair in the Harvard School of Theology to human secularism. In the Supreme Court decision on prayer in school, one of the justices wrote in his statement that human secularism was a religion. I say it worships the small god of self and has the holy trinity of race, class, and genders. If you say that it's paganism, there are many people who say, well, I'm a Christian or I'm a Jew, and they will puff themselves up and still trying to defend their leftist views. But I would argue that they are, as Lenin said about capitalists, they are useful fools. The main break, the main failure was in the 1920s, especially because of Darwin and Darwinism, mainstream Protestants lost confidence in biblical Christianity. They were unable to answer the questions that arose from Darwinism, the conflict between science and the conflict between science and the Bible. And then they absolutely could not answer the horrific losses, the mindless industrial killing of World War I. They didn't have an answer for it. In the meantime, there were counter movements. There are counter movements. Great movie out now about the Jesus freaks from the 1969, and there's still a Bible Belt in this country. To the family, this is the last bastion. This is where the culture war will ultimately be won or lost. There were huge changes in sexual mores and behaviors in the 1920s, and then it was a big deal. And then even greater than that in the 1960s, where sexual revolution, federal welfare destroying families, especially the black families, divorce rate of 50%. And the family is still up for grabs from both sides. So I'm getting at 45 minutes here. When I say the beginning of the culture war, or the obvious start of the culture war, I mean, the ideas began back in 1790, but the split in America was in 1962. It's because when the courts made that decision, they knew, the Supreme Court, they knew they weren't going to be impeached. They may have held those ideas for longer, since before 1962, but they knew they weren't going to be impeached. And that's when enough of the culture shifted to where they felt confident in doing what they were doing. Back in the 1930s, Justice Frankfurter said, the Constitution is what I say it is. So they had plenty of leftists in government, plenty of leftists in the courts. But in 62, Things had changed enough that they felt they could do that. I could add another slide on that timeline to politics, because it's interesting to show the movements, because in America, or people organized, there are movements, organizations, monetized with plenty of funding, and key leaders through time. And there's been a push and pull between liberal and conservative, between two worldviews through time. But today, where we are, is that there is no common ground in the culture war. And the left continues to move further left into loony. And then this is just a little bit more elaboration on it, just that, the left has a narrative. They always have a narrative. They hijack the moral superiority of the civil rights movement, and now they conflate all states' rights with segregation, and identity politics create a permanent hierarchy of victims. So, thanks for listening to the presentation. I'm at 8:46. And like I would have loved to have lingered over all of these slides. There's a wealth of information and discussion that we could have over these slides. I hope you had a chance at least to read them while I was talking. So that's what I have, Chris.
A couple of announcements, quick announcements. ACAT has a website. We invite you to visit it. There's a lot of stuff on there. It's at spiderandthefly.com with hyphens between the words, spider, hyphen, etc. We put up a weekly news roundup of anti-communism news from home and abroad. That's free on the website. And we also have a speakers bureau. We have survivors of communism and subject matter experts who are available by video conferencing anywhere, and also will appear in person in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a sign up for the weekly mailings, and that is at mail@spiderandthefly.com, again with hyphens between the words. This is completely grassroots. These are people who are concerned about the direction of the country. So I'm not trying to make money at this. So as a consequence, your contact information is never sold or shared. Now we're going to go into questions and answers, but we have a question from Joe. How will a financial downturn or collapse impact the cultural divide? Will it worsen or improve? Will MAGA win? Jim, what do you say?
I'll take a shot at that. One of the best jobs I ever had, at the end of my time in the Army, I was the director of a Army Futures program. It was called Army 21, 1991, 1990, 1992. We projected it out to the year 2005, 2015. And we looked at everything: sociology, economics, foreign threats, education, everything. After that, I spent the next 20 years, whenever I could, I was a contractor. Sometimes I got the contract, sometimes I didn't, working in Army futures, looking out 20 and 30 years from now. And so from that, we learned from the great philosopher Yogi Berra that there is nothing harder to predict than the future. And so if you follow that, there's nothing harder to predict than the future. There are a number of things, what brought us together in World War II? It was a war of national survival. It was a war for Western civilization after the Brits had carried the load alone, and then we came in to help them and to take over, to save Western civilization, to create the Pax Americana, which lasted up until this time. If the economic downturn is bad enough, we will unify. Just like if we have an EMP, electromagnetic explosion over the United States, and we go back to the 19th century, all of us, we will probably unite. When China nukes us, we will probably unite. If there's a real pandemic where not the one we just had, but like the Black Death, we will probably unite. Short of that, no, we'll divide. I think anything less than something catastrophic, we will continue to divide, and we'll divide worse.
Okay, next question is, how can America recover from the damage that has been done and is being done by the left communist agenda?
Win the culture war. Win the culture war. We have to either retake I was a former infantry officer, so this whole thing about you take the hill. We have to either reconquer those 5 mountains, or we have to build alternative mountains that are good and better. We have to win the culture war. And the thing, I gave a presentation that's a predecessor to this, basically the origins of the culture war. I didn't get into all the how by institution we changed. I gave that a couple of weeks ago at a church conference here locally, and I was asked the same question. And the the answer to that is for every individual where they live to pick out you have your family, you're already in your family, you already have your religion, you have whatever body of faith that you attend and you participate in. So those are 2 mountains that you can fight here. And then the other thing you can do is pick what you're going to want, it's going to be education, business, government. Pick your mountain, and you're in it to win it. We have to win the culture war.
Okay, let me just add that I heard something interesting on NPR this evening. It was 2 commentators talking about new polling, and they viewed the culture war as just something that was politically harming the Republicans. So that's the spin that's coming from the left, that there is no real culture war. It's just a thing that the Republicans do, and they're shooting themselves in the foot by doing it. Next question comes from Sharon, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Chris, can I address that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I spent 20 years in party politics, and then I quit running for party office. I was a local chairman. I was on the state central committee in Virginia, the governing body, the Republican Party of Virginia, for 12 years, and I was a congressional district party chairman. The establishment, Republicans and Democrats, 2 wings of the same bird, the establishment will always tell you that the culture war is a distractor. Yes, on a culture war issue, you will lose some voters, you'll pick up some voters. I'm trying to say this in a nice way. The elections are determined by people who don't pay attention and either vote bread or butter. The elections are voted guns or butter. I said bread and butter. Excuse me, guns or butter. The elections, ultimately, you don't get elected necessarily on a culture war issue. You get elected on very pragmatic issues. But you have got to look at using the power in government when you're in power to swing the culture war to our way, to win the culture war. But they're all going to, the career politicians will tell you that all the time. And if that's all you do, if you're a culture war only in Virginia, you're going to get 25% of the vote, 25%. If you're there on economics, on education, not as it from a cultural aspect, but from improving education and improving the economic situation, then that can carry up to 52% in Virginia. I'm sorry, so next question.
All right, Jim, if you could unshare your screen, we'll go on to the next question. The Muslim Brotherhood is infiltrated, and so Sharon sees the split speeding up because the Muslims push the left to do things like violence, openly espouse their anti-Semitism and Christian hate, etc. They also allow things like the perversions, transsexuals, until they gain enough power to stop it because it is anti-Semitic. What do you say to all that, Jim?
I say totalitarians of a feather flock together. 90% of the Muslims in the world are Islamists, or they believe in the Quran. They actually believe in it. And want to kill you and your family. So they are Islamist totalitarians, and the left are human secularist totalitarians. They're both totalitarians. They're going to work together until just as Hitler and Stalin worked together until they decided to kill each other.
All right, we'll go on to the next question. Comes from, where do you see hope that there might be cracks in this ongoing divide?
Where do I see the cracks in what?
In the divide, in the ongoing divide. Might be cracks in the ongoing divide. Well, his next comment is he thinks he sees cracks in the education system as colleges get expensive and deliver very little to students but extreme debt. So I think his point is these institutions you outlined have been captured but maybe there's some rearguard actions possible because they can't hold on to the territory that they've conquered. Go ahead.
Right. Classical Marxism was flawed. The Marx's understanding of economics, his understanding of history was wrong. So if the foundation's wrong, and then the building you build above it, Marxism, it's all wrong. And ultimately, it collapsed. It failed, completely failed. Cultural Marxism is the same thing. The cultural Marxism is based on lies. And because of that, ultimately, it will fail. The top universities in the country, or by reputation, that are producing graduates, they're producing graduates who will ultimately denigrate those institutions to where they'll become the laughing stock. Public school, they're going to fail. So let me put it in plain English. The left, and many of them, let me say this, they have good hearts. They mean well. But everything they want to do is wrong, and it's going to fail. Now, the problem is the failure is going to cause suffering and pain, and the worst possible failure is if you have something, a civil war, like a Spanish Civil War II, where people are killing each other. But the left will fail. But along the way, I mean, how long did it take the Soviet Union? 70 years. How much pain was in that 70 years? So.
All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I've got two quick ones to round out the formal session. And the first is, I wanted to have you do this webinar because I firmly believe a lot of the craziness we're seeing today traces back to the French Revolution. So my first question is, do you have any recommended reading on the French Revolution for people to help people to understand it better?
The answer is yes, but I'm looking back here. Let me just tell you, 40 years ago, I took oral exams, and I had to know 276 books. I can't tell you those 276 books today, but I did at that for the oral exam. I had to know the book and who wrote it and what they said. And I have a couple of great histories of the French Revolution, but I would have to find the title and the author. Now, on the Enlightenment, and the difference is Gertrude Himmelfarb. She has two books that are talking about the United States and its cultural divide, and then also basically on the cultural, the Enlightenments. Gertrude Himmelfarb, and then there's another author that I have to go look him up because I fail to retain all that information. I fail to retain my bibliography, but I can find it.
Gertrude Himmelfarb is great. I used to like reading her in Commentary magazine in the 90s, back when it was worth reading. Anyway.
She died a few years ago. Brilliant, just incredible.
Absolutely. I want to finish the formal part of the agenda with this last question. Okay, so in the French Revolution, they had the terror and they had the guillotine, and they didn't have a stable government for 75 years after that. And I'm just wondering what you think about the question of, can it happen here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, it can. Yes, it can. I mean, to me, we had an awful civil war. We had a terrible, tragic, I can't find the words that are big enough, war between the states. If we had but it was regional, and it had uniforms, and both sides were governed by the same biblical worldview. So while there were war crimes, there was not the indiscriminate slaughter and the industrial slaughter that then followed in World War I and World War II by all sides, including us, the bombing that we did. If we had, we could, if the violence if you have enough violence, political violence, and if it reaches a certain level, you could have a spark. And to me, the nightmare scenario is a Spanish Civil War, where neighbors kill neighbors based on how they voted, which is just, it's insane and it's horrific. They murdered one another based on how they had lists, and they murdered one another based on how they voted. So yes, it could happen. The thing that the saving grace I say, and I want to say this real quickly, I believe that Donald Trump unknowingly put together a coalition that's actually a governing coalition that's actually bigger than FDR's. And it includes people in white working class people, and by that I mean people who earn wages and who are small business owners and professionals in the Northeast and in Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, Ohio. Those white working class Yankees, I like to call them, may save the country because they are not culturally conservative, but they are pragmatic, and they know that they're getting screwed in the economy, and they know they're getting their opportunities for their children, both in the economy and in education, and where education is going, that they're getting screwed, and that there's also potential for hostile foreign powers to make things even worse. And that, if we can get past the cheat in 5 states, or 7, if you can get past the cheat in the swing states, in the metropolitan areas, in those swing states, there is a governing majority that could create a coalition that's bigger than FDR.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. Jim, thanks very much for a fine presentation.